Hi, it's Simon Hobbs from Presource here. We're doing the next video in the series where we're going to add DDEV development environment to our site. And just a really quick recap of what we've been doing here is we have a site that this is the playlist so far. So we've built out our website with composer.json, and we've added the local settings structure, and we've added Lando local development environment. And in this video, we're going to add DDEV. You wouldn't normally have two local development environments, but these are both good quality products, and so I feel like it's a really interesting thing to do. So just to recap on the last video, I did add a few things since then. I have the main things is I moved the trusted host patterns into the main settings.php basically any site that's running on will accept any domain, and it's a little bit of a security thing to have trusted host patterns. However, Platform SH defaults to this as well, and so this will just work for everything. And then also I just renamed this file from override to env to just be a little bit more consistent with how people do this. So very minor things. And so let's jump into what we're going to do today. This is our code base as it stands at the moment. And so I'm going to jump straight into it and not waste your time and add a DDEV folder. And inside that DDEV folder, I'm going to add a config.yaml. Now, when you're running DDEV has tools so that you sort of build new projects, and it'll build it all out without having to sort of do very much at all. But in the spirit of this video, what we're doing is we are micromanaging everything. So we're going to have a name similar to Lando. We're going to have a name for our file. In fact, I'll open up the Lando file side by side. So this is the Lando file to remember. We've had a name and a recipe. So we've got a name for our project. We have a type, which is similar to recipe. We set the doc root. Do a couple of things, which is similar to Lando, where we're going to set our web server type because we don't want to have the htaccess file in our code base. So we've got a PHP version. And now something that we're going to do that is important in this that we don't do by default in Lando is we tell it not to muck around with our settings. So we don't want DDEV to control our settings.php and related files. Now, if you are, this works really well. You don't have to, this is just for the purposes of this video, you don't have to use this setting. For the purpose of this video, we are micromanaging these settings, so we need to tell DDEV not to touch it. But something else to be aware of is, because we're running multiple local development environments, something else we don't also need to do is tell DDEV to use different ports. So 99.9% of the cases, you're going to be fine just using default ports of 80 and 443. But because we're mucking around, we got Lando, which has already got 80 and 443 by default. We're going to tell DDEV to use 8080 and 8443. And another sort of slightly interesting thing is that since we're telling DDEV not to do settings management, if you let DDEV do all of the work, it will do this for you. Whoops, that is the wrong domain. That's come from somewhere else. Where does that come from? I'll update that in a second. So that's actually the Lando domain. So we're going to be setting a domain here. And this will happen by default if you're letting DDEV do all the work, but we have to actually tell it the domain. So what we're going to do is, with that configuration file, we should be able to start DDEV. Now, but before we do that, I'm also going to get our settings.php set up. So as said before, we want to have multiple development environments for this. So we're going to basically, we've just inspected what DDEV does, and we're going to do exactly the same thing that DDEV does. And we're going to say, well, if Lando's on, or if there's this variable called isDDEV project, if that's true. And then we're going to we're going to include our local settings. And so obviously then in our local settings, as opposed to, Lando, in this environment, we're going to have that same configuration. So I'm just going to copy paste this in, but it's pretty similar. So we have, if the environment is DDEV, and in the case of this is pretty similar to most situations you get, because the database is internal in the Docker networking. These are always just some standard value, DB, 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 DB. They'll always be the same. The driver will always be MySQL. The port will always be 3306. So so Lando does actually have this configuration variable, but you'd find with Lando a really similar situation. These values won't change. Like the database is always Drupal 10, Drupal 10, Drupal 10. But Lando has this this environment configuration that lets us sort of use that, because if the recipe changes, actually the database name changes and so forth. Whereas with DDEV, it's always going to be this. So that should give our site everything that it needs to get up and running. And you'll see that we're sort of sharing all of these development settings. I've discussed that in previous videos. So the next thing to do is let's get started. Let's get DDEV up and running. So DDEV start is what I want. Hopefully everything is hunky-dory. Okay, so we've got it started. I just needed to fix up my settings here with while that's starting. I'll just mention that I've just updated my settings to be correct there, to set the Drush options. For what it's worth, this doesn't stop Drush from working. It just means when you run commands like Drush user login, you get a URL that will work. And it's obviously hard coding that port to the port that we're setting here. So, okay, so we've started. We already had the images all downloaded, so that was relatively quick. And so we see this message here, not creating CMS settings files, so that's fantastic. So let's go and before we jump and have a look at what's changed in the code, let's make sure that we can connect with Drush. Okay, that looks really good. And so you can see that options URI has been successfully applied. And let's also install Drupal. So DDEV Drush site install minimal. And yes. And then DDEV Drush site install user login. And we should get a fully qualified user login address now. And if I copy this into my browser, you can see here that we've got a logged in site. So we're still running Lando alongside it. So we have Lando and DDEV running at the same time. We've allowed Lando to take port 443 or port 80, and we've asked DDEV to not do that. We have to make a choice about which one's going to get port 80 effectively, or port 443. So jumping over to the code, the first thing let's look at is, so this is all the same, and local settings, nothing's changed. If I do a get diff, you'll notice that I've got my new settings here, and I've changed my configuration. And so the code's still the same. So DDEV hasn't added anything. If I do a git status, you can see that there's there's the DDEV folder that I added, and so that's pretty good. So that's following our desire to have minimal addition of code. So, but actually, what's happening here is DDEV has created a bunch of files, and I wouldn't worry about this too much. If I add, let's add the DDEV.config and commit that. Control-C-X. And then we do a git status. So you can, now that DDEV folder is added, you notice that none of these other files, these files are all ignored by this git ignore file. So this really isn't, it's very visible. It looks like it's a lot of extra stuff compared to Lando, but Lando's really doing that outside of the code base. It's doing all the same things. Under the hood, Lando's using Docker Compose. At least it was the last time I checked. So in some ways, you know, a lot of this stuff has a lot of really good visibility, and some developers would prefer having all of this information here, such as the Docker Compose file that DDEV's using, and you know, information about the images and so forth. That's all really informative and something you can learn from, whereas Lando doesn't give you that opportunity, so that's something to be aware of. So we've just we've just added our config, and we're going to pretty much ignore all of this stuff here, and we're going to let DDev manage this stuff through the lifetime of our project. And I think that's pretty much all there is to talk about. We have, we've demonstrated what we want. We have our site running here. There's 2 sites running side by side. And as you'll see, I'm going to push and tag this code, and you'll see there's very minimal code. As always, the code will be linked to from the YouTube video summary. And thanks very much. And in the next video, we're going to look at potentially doing a custom Docker Compose setup. Thank you.